Hello, members. Welcome. Good evening. And welcome, Catherine, my partner in dairy crime this evening. Cheers, Catherine.
Hello, Anna. Good evening, members.
We're absolutely thrilled. Members. Welcome. Good evening. Sorry about that. We're thrilled to have you tonight. Catherine and I were just chatting before we came on air, and we actually think we probably couldn't have picked four better wines for this balmy UK evening. I have to be careful because I did say that yesterday in my sip size on English wines and was told off because the north of England was not experiencing quite the heat wave that we're getting down here in the south. But if you are, we have got Roger and Jean from sunny York. So there we go. If you are joining us from somewhere sunny tonight, then we do hope you're going to be grateful that we've chosen four delicious, fresh, juicy white wines to pair with cheese. And we're hoping that we're going to do white wine and cheese pairing a bit of a testament, but obviously in particular it's French wine and French cheeses. So very excited for you all to join us. I've got all four wines here. I did mention in the email about keeping them cool, and I'm glad I did, but we are going to start with the Vouvray this evening, which is out of shot, I apologise. The Vouvray and the Chignin, and then we're going to go on to the Chardonnay and the Sauternes. And so if you are tasting along this evening, please have your Vouvray ready if you want to, and I recommend that you can keep the others in the fridge. Obviously, we haven't been able to, otherwise it would be a rather interesting event, running back and forward to the kitchen. But of course, if you'd like to keep them cool, we do encourage you to do so. They'll taste lovely and fresh. So before we crack on, a few small bits of housekeeping. I'm sure many of you already know what I'm about to say, but please do use the chat as you have been to let us know where you are and what you think of the wines. We'd love to hear what you think of the pairings, whether you like them, whether you loathe them, whether you think something would work better, or even if you're trying something else, please let us know. We like to see into all your lives, and then use the Q&A for questions. Now, as many of you who've joined these cheese events will have probably noticed, Ben from the Fine Cheese Company is not here today, and that's because he has just gone on paternity leave. He's having a baby. Well, his partner's having a baby. So Catherine and I have spent the last couple of days genning up, being taught by the lovely Ruth from the Fine Cheese Company. So we hope we have all the information relevant to answer your questions this evening, but we apologize if there's something we can't answer in the Q&A regarding the cheese tonight, then we will hand it back over to the Fine Cheese Company and we'll get your answers in writing. So apologies in advance. We're wine people, but I'd like to say, Catherine, wouldn't you agree we're kind of cheese people as well?
I feel we are now. I feel we've got enough of these under our belts that I feel we're quite on there with, talking about the paste and the bloom and the rind. But who knows, members, you might catch us out. And if that happens, we'll revert to Ben and let you know.
We'll revert to the fine cheese wizards and we'll let you know. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to present the first wine, and then I'm going to follow up with the cheese. So Catherine, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So yes, good evening, members. So the first wine we've got is the Famille Bougrier. It's the Vouvray. It's the Sec Confidence. Now, Vouvray, as you may or may not know, is one of the perhaps most famous, most respected appellations in the Loire Valley in the Touraine-Graham region. And the title covers white Chenin Blanc across all the styles, from sweet, dry, still and sparkling, from the 8 villages around the medieval town of Vouvray. Now, this one that we've got is a dry style. It's a dry, still style. And it is something that I think in terms of pairing with a goat's cheese, maybe something that you would expect, or perhaps you were expecting maybe a Sauvignon, but I think this gives a little bit more of a slight fruitier freshness to this cheese. So let me talk a bit more about the wine before we go on to why the pairing works. And if you do have the wines, as Anna said, it's a very warm evening, at least where we are, so don't hold back. Do pour yourself a refreshing sample and enjoy while I give you a bit more information. So Famille Bougrier is a very well-known and long-established sort of production house. It's the Maison Bougrier in the Loire. They were founded in 1885 and they are now run by the 6th generation. And as well as producing wines under their own label, they are also a very important negociant in the region. So the negociant aspect being that they can buy in grapes from other growers, blend them into some nice wines, or work as a bit of a middleman's not the nicest term for it, but it works to have that community feel of wine production. And I think that's something that is really impressive about Bougrier, is that they're so established and their winemaking is so established as a negociant model that actually it really does just give that real community winemaking feel to what they've got going on in the Loire. Now, as I said, it's now on the 6th generation, and it is Nicolas that is the 6th, and his sister Sophie as well, but she does a little less in terms of the actual winemaking and the day-to-day of the winery and the vineyards, but she is always there to share the wines around the world and to make them known. Now, this is the Confidence of Vouvray. Now, the name that they've gone for with this and using it as Confidence is a confident sort of aspect. It sort of covers the way they make this wine under this label is covering off grapes that show the best level of wines within the region. So it's not every vintage. This is now on the 4th vintage. So this is the 2021. And it's just to have a range or a label that has the best expression of the terroir and the region. So as we said, this is from the Touraine region. So the winemaking and the soils here is a lovely sort of limestoney soil. There's lovely drainage. Being in the Loire Valley, you've got that gorgeous amount of sunlight and warmth that you get from the elevation. So the grapes really come to their full maturity before harvest. And it's got a really ripe, lovely freshness to it. There's a lot of sort of a quincy pear sort of scent to it. It's quite a perfumed fruit, quite that perfumed white fruit, while still retaining some crispness of a green apple, and there's some blossom in there as well. It also does spend a bit of time on the fine lees, so that adds a really lovely bit of texture. Now, this is one of those interesting terms, and we've spoken about it before as to what sort of the texture means. It kind of goes hand in hand with what minerality means. But in this one, it's a really nice mouthfeel for me. And I think when you're pairing it with the cheese, it adds that sort of, or not necessarily adds, but is in harmony with the slight chalky element of the cheese. So you've got that lovely, ripe, bright fruit, the really fresh acidity from the Chenin, which is synonymous with the grape, but you've also got that lovely texture from that little bit of contact with the fine lees being the yeast cells, and it really just rounds it all out. And I think it's a really nice pairing to start. So members, if you've got it, let us know what you're thinking. And Anna, do you want to tell us a little bit about the cheese?
Oh, I certainly do. Yeah, first things first, we've already had somebody say the Vouvray is terrific. And I agree, Catherine. I think this is an inspired choice. I think it's so easy to default to Sancerre or a Sauvignon-based wine from the Loire. And when you first picked it, I thought, okay, well, I'll see what happens here. And it's absolutely fantastic. I think you're right, that chalkiness coming through with the chalkiness of the cheese, it's brilliant. So Galet de Tours, I've already dug into mine. I will hold it up, but it's been partially munched. So it's a goat's cheese, and it's made using raw milk. And I think that rawness of the milk for me gives that amazing tangy flavor, which I think is another reason it pairs so well. Now, if anyone's more familiar with Celles Séchères, which is a more common goat's cheese, I suppose, that we find here in the UK. This is a sort of, it's not a Celles Séchères, but it's very, very similar. In fact, it's basically not got the proper shape that gives it the AOP labelling, because just like wines, and Catherine's explained the designation about the place Vouvray, much like that, there are rules and regulations about cheese production. difference between this and a salsiccia, that's a mouthful, is that there's a little bit more moisture and a bit more saltiness than those particular cheeses. And actually, you can even see the moisture. I don't know, members, whether the moisture came through in your paper. This was a cheese for me that had a soggy bottom, as Mary Berry would describe it. But you can kind of feel it here. And on the bottom of mine, the moisture has started to come through. But I love that with a juicy wine like this, that kind of richness, but at the same time, really mouth-watering through the acid as well. I'll quickly get my screen up and show you a little more about the cheese whilst I talk. So obviously we've said, we talked about the Loire Valley. This is from the Loire Valley, surprise, surprise, the best home of goat's cheese in the world. And Rodolphe Lemonnier is the producer here. He's the cheesemaker, and he actually won, and you're going to have to excuse my French pronunciation, the Meilleur Ouvrier de France, which is the sort of prestigious cheesemaker award in France, and he won that in 2007. Obviously that looks exactly like my part-eaten cheese, but they've managed to preserve theirs on the side. And here he is. Here is Rodolphe, very, very happy, smiley, as you would be if you made such fantastic cheeses. Now, lovely story about him. Quickly, I'm conscious of time, but I have to say, when Ruth said this story and told us this story, I couldn't not repeat it. Rodolphe came back to the family business in the 20s, but actually he has a family history with goat's cheese, and his grandmother in World War II, she basically would secrete goat's milk cheeses from occupied Paris through the black market, and then all through the 50s. And so she was a massive fan of goat's cheese, his grandmother. And then in the 50s started making her own cheeses, whereas actually it was Rodolphe's father who then moved to focus on what they call in France affinage. And affinage is a lovely, beautiful terminology. It's basically saying refine in French. And that, when cheese is concerned, what that means is you take these young, squeaky, fresh goat milk puddings of cheese, and you finely press the curds that have little sort of personality or expression before, and it's this beautiful French idea of transforming something over time into the variety of cheeses that we can see. So affinage is the beautiful French word we're going to use here. And his way is you can take the same cheese, but the affinage, what you do to it, how you age it, is what's important. And you can see his cheeses aging here absolutely beautifully. And he says that the three things that influence this cheese the most, or two things are the bacteria and the paste. So you need a really good paste, you need a good base to work with, but the bacteria is really important. And so you need to manipulate these conditions. So much like keeping your cellar, carefully monitoring levels of bacteria in your wine cellar, you actually need to monitor your drying racks here. And so you can leave it, leaving it in these perfect conditions, you get the rind thickening up, but you need to have this balance. So it's got a soft, squishy rind, which I really love in a goat's cheese, but it's definitely still got that age to it. And I think with that age comes a slight, ever so slight smokiness. It's not the level of smokiness that, I'm just going to show you a goat now. It's not the level of smokiness that you get from some of those harder rind goat's cheeses, in my opinion, where sometimes it can almost be a bit metallic. It's got a lot more freshness to that, and that really does come from the moisture and all of these bacteria that he's working with. What do you think, Catherine?
I agree. I think that you would think after doing a lot of these cheese and wine pairings that I would be more comfortable with goat's cheese, but I always find they taste a little bit goaty, which members I hope makes sense when I say that. But this one, I think particularly as well, why I wanted to go with the Vouvray rather than perhaps a Sauvignon that was more expected, is that it doesn't have as much of that metallic green sort of fresh herby quality that other, thank you, John, the clue is in the name, that some other goat's cheese can have. That sort of slightly more, it's not a bitterness and it's not an astringency, but it's definitely, for me, more of a herb, more herbal, a more savory herb. And I think this has a level of sort of sweeter fruit and when you think of sort of like yeasts and the nice bacterias. When you have some food that perhaps is slightly on the turn, it does get a sweet quality to it. And I think that sweetness that comes through is what's really nice to go with the wine and the sort of the fruits that we're getting in this wine. It's the riper green fruits. You're almost going into a little bit of a stone fruit with this one, which is, I think it's a very nice pairing.
I think it's a cracking pairing. Good job. I really like it. And like you say, if you've got one of those goat's cheese that's packed full of kind of grassy herbaceous notes, then Sauvignon Blanc can often be the key. But I think with this one, it's got other things going on. And I think you were absolutely right to choose a Chenin instead. I've got the thumbs up, Catherine. I spotted a member said I was a bit muffled. I have just readjusted my microphone, which is why you heard that lovely little tune playing. Please, members, do let me know if I'm still muffled and I can readjust again. But hopefully you can hear me loud and clear now. Catherine, I guess we're ready to move on to wine number 2.
We are, lovely. So, Tim has just popped in a comment that he's got a Rachel goat from Somerset, which goes well with New Zealand Sauvignon. Now that I do agree with Tim. I find the Rachel goat cheese is very herbal, very like grassy and herbaceous, which is lovely. And going with a New Zealand Sauvignon is an excellent pairing. But we are now going on to wine number 2. Now I've only got the one glass this evening, but if members, you have more than one glass, so if you've got them to compare, what might be nice is just to actually have a look at the difference in color with this one. It's much more of a golden hue. Yeah, perfect. Anna's got that to show you now. So obviously we're into a different grape variety, but it's just nice to see that comparison of, we've got a nice range of white wines this evening, and we've got a nice range of colors and styles as well, I think. So perfect pairings for the cheeses. Now, this is the Chignin-Bergeron au Pays de Tours, Domaine Jean-François Quénard, and it is the 2020 vintage. Bergeron, to clear off to start with, is what the local sort of name or dialect in the Savoie region for the Roussanne grape. And it is a speciality of the village of Chignin-Bergeron in the Savoie. The Savoie being in the sort of area near the French Alps. So you may be more familiar with Roussanne from the Rhône, but this one is from Savoie and it is known as Bergeron. Now, in terms of the effect that has on the grape, it is a fuller flavored, it's a crisper style, which almost sounds a little bit of an oxymoron by saying it's crisper but fuller flavored. I don't know if members, you're familiar with Roussanne as a grape, as a single varietal from the Rhône. It can be quite rich and quite opulent, but also used in white blends in the Rhône, and adds that really lovely peachy apricot quality. And because of the style of fruit, it can feel quite full flavored, but this one is that little bit more, and we'll come on to why a little bit later, but it also has a crisper acidity, which does mean in terms of pairing with cheese or with any food, you've got that lovely food-friendly acidity, as well as lots of concentration in flavor. Now, the domain of Jean-François Quénard is a family domain, and it is now headed up by Jean-Pierre and Jean-François. So Jean-Pierre is the son, and it's been handed down from father to son since 1644. It's actually located in the upper part of the commune, and it's at the foot of the famous towers of Chignin. So I don't know if anyone's been there and seen the towers, but that is where it's located. And the origins of the towers do actually remain a little bit in mystery as to what they were for and why they are there, but they are still there. So if you're ever thinking of going to a holiday in that region, do look them out. As I said, it's Jean-François. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around. It is Jean-François is the son, and he returned to the family domain So returned to work with his father, Jean-Pierre, in 1987 after he had graduated from the University of Dijon, so as an enologist, and then he had moved around France a little bit to get some experience. So in Bordeaux at the Grisillac laboratory and Domaine l'Espegot near Montpellier. And he also spent some time in California. And then once he returned, the domain has grown from 5 to 15 hectares. So obviously his experience has meant that there could be developments in what they are doing, but not so much that they are losing the traditional sort of style of wine. Now, Andrew, I just want to address that very quickly. Is that the cheese or the wine that the comment is?
Just for members not reading the chat, Andrew has said
maybe
like cow pat.
Now that may be because it is a little bit earthy. It's got some earthiness to it, and also so does the cheese. But if it is something that, oh, it's the cheese. Oh, well, that's good to know, because I was going to direct you to member services if you had a wine that smelled like that, because that really wasn't what I was expecting you to say. But yes, the cheese is very much countryside. But we'll let Anna go on to the cheese in a moment. But talking about sort of where this is grown, and you might think, oh, in the locality and the proximity it is to the Alps, that might actually mean it's not great in terms of ripening, or in terms of getting the full maturity of the grapes. But actually they have a bit of a interesting microclimate in that region, and they do get some lovely warmth. And they've also got, the key thing is that they've got some really great elevation of their hillsides, so it can go up to about a 45-degree slope. And then because of that, all the harvesting has to be manual, because it's quite tricky to get a machine up a slope that's that much of a tilt. And also the vine age is around 40 years or more, so it's some really long established vines. So the fruit that is produced is really concentrated. It's had a long time the vines have had a long time to focus their efforts into the fruit. And it does mean that the yield is relatively low. It's about 40 hectolitres per hectare, but that then does retain the quality of the grapes. So it's healthy grapes that are at their optimum ripeness and concentration of fruit. And they then, after their hand harvesting, they have a direct pressing, and then the must is on a cold settling for about 24 hours, and that coolness retains the acidity and retains the flavour of the fruit as well. They vinify in stainless steel, which is very important to them in retaining the flavours of the terroir and almost enhancing them as well. It does then go through some malolactic fermentation, which just softens out the acidity a little bit. It rounds it out and gets the fruit to come through a bit more. And again, this has some time on lees, so it has about 9 to 12 months fermentation on lees. They have a few stirrings just to kind of get it all mixed up and get all the lees and the wine in contact with each other, so it can have a really nicely well-rounded wine.
I love it, Catherine.
It comes through.
Oh, it does. What an amazing texture.
It really is, isn't it? I think the texture is the key thing. And for me, in terms of pairing it with a cheese that also has a really great texture, maybe a bit more of an unctuous texture, you want that sort of partnership, but you still want the acidity, so it's not too overbearing.
I think it's cracking. I'm going to tell you a bit about the Reblochon Fermier. But what I would like to address first is the cowpat comment, because I think it's really fair. When Ruth was saying what the tasting notes are of the cheese, it's a cheese of two halves, this cheese, in my opinion, all opinions. So it's from the same region. So it's from the Haut-Savoie. So it's produced by Joseph Paccard, and I'll tell you a bit more about the Paccard brothers in a moment. But if you've got this cheese this evening, the cheese, I really strongly encourage you to eat the rind. This is a cheese designed to eat the rind, and the combination of the two parts is really what gives you your flavour here. So if you look at it, it's paper thin, the rind, but that is where you're getting that cow pat type texture, smell, sorry. And the cheesemakers, sorry, are describing things like leather, which I think is a very much a cow smell, farm. So they note that it smells of farm, and it's like Catherine said, it's this Provençal, provincial, earthy, farm-based cheese, and it is really supposed to smell like that. But the inside, this middle part here, is much more the fresh milk. It's quite nutty, and it's floral, and it's got the kind of crispness and tartness of a creme fraiche as well. Not quite the texture, but you can kind of see where I'm getting at with that tang. So I think what Catherine did here, which was really clever, is she picked a wine that had all of those things in it, or at least could manage all of those things, because it is quite a complicated cheese to have the leather and the farm. But it does, in my opinion, really need a white wine, because that density is what needs the acidity. And I do think Roussanne, for me, always provides a bit of that honeyed nut note. And I think the fact that the cheese is quite nutty, that really works. So a little bit about the Packards. They work exclusively with raw milk cheeses. So here they are making the cheeses. They are situated in Manigod in the Haut-Savoie. And this is actually the Packard brothers' flagship cheese. Demand is really, really high. Supply is incredibly limited. So there are very few places that you can actually buy this cheese. We're quite lucky to be the fortunate few that get our hands on it. It is intensive. It's time intensive. It's very hands-on. You can literally see them creating it here by hand. And they only use the best farmstead milk. So the Fine Cheese Company said this is easily the best farmstead Reblochon they've ever tasted. And the milk is exclusively from these two separate farms, all within the region, within the commune. And so an incredibly local cheese. What I find really interesting is that, again, each of the rooms of the Packard brothers, they have to get the balance right of all of these components when you're in these rooms. So from our understanding, the balance in the air has to be from ammonia, CO2, and you have to get the right circulation of air, the right temperature, the right humidity in order to age these cheeses to come out like this. And the quote that I will read is, "If you want to understand a cheese, you have to know its environment. Our terroir is made special by a mixture of our altitude, the quality and variety of our grasses, and also the trees." And I know I spoke about spruce, but around the landscape here, fir and spruce really dominate. And you can't taste the spruce necessarily, but actually it's, first of all, it's a perfect shelving material, I've heard. It doesn't necessarily impart a woody taste as they mature, but the microflora within the spruce helps to develop the rind and the paste of the cheese. So it's very much a wine not only made locally, but using local materials, ensuring it's a bit like selecting barrels for wine, you know, based on their specific characteristics. The local fir and spruce in particular trees, the microflora and all of the things that come with using that wood that they do use, as you can see here, is absolutely crucial. The company was founded in 1990, and they worked for 20 years, Joseph Packard, in his local co-op. And then he developed this sort of appreciation for these farmstead cow's milk cheeses and built his first cellar underneath his house. And then by the 1990s, late 1990s, basically he didn't have space. So he built this new place to produce the cheeses about 2 kilometers from the house. And they've built special cement ceilings that allow some permeation of air, but they allow the cheeses to breathe. And actually what astounded me when I learned about this cheese is that they have a steady temperature of around 11 to 12 degrees just because of this concrete building, but also that the humidity in the room is a constant 98%. So they've sort of naturally produced this very specific environment in order for this cheese to thrive, which, when you start thinking about it like that, I mean, the work that goes into cheeses like this, I'm really not surprised that demand is high and supply is low, because it's a craft of love, this cheese. What did you think, Catherine? Is this more up your street than a goat?
It is. And I think it is because of that lovely savoury sweet comparison.
Mhm.
So the rind, I think it's got that really lovely, almost a little bit, for me, like a little bit like a yeast extract sort of savoury note. So
Marmitey.
Yeah, Marmitey.
Yeah.
A little bit of that Marmitey tang, and then you've got that lovely sweet. The texture is great. I'm surprised at how well it's held up for me this evening, because it's I was expecting a little bit more of a gooiness, but I think that's perhaps why I prefer it to these other softer rind cheeses that are, things like your Bries and, your Baron Bigods that can go a little bit oozy. This also keeps its texture. And Roger and Jean have just said that the wine is perfect for tartiflette. Yeah. The cheese is perfect for it. I don't know if I could manage that this evening. It might be a bit warm, but absolutely agree. And I think it's just such we don't want to get too romantic about it, but it's such a nice story, and the craftsmanship that goes into it as well. I think whether that makes it taste better, I think it does. And it's nice that we can have those sort of stories about the cheeses and about the wines, and they, just working in harmony.
And somebody's asked where is this place exactly? So it is in the Haut-Savoie, so Upper Savoie, in a commune called Manigod, which is in the valley of Aravis, and I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, which is actually about 1,000 meters altitude, so it's quite high up. So it's a real mountain wine, as we discussed. So anybody that's been around to the I imagine it's probably Aravis Valley, that's where this is based, but the actual commune it's based in is called Manigod. So I hope that helps. And then somebody's asked about how old the cheese is. So they're actually sent over relatively fresh. My understanding, and this could be wrong from memory, is that they're aged for 20 days to get to this state, and then obviously they come over and they're shipped, etc. So yeah, not an old cheese. This is a relatively young cheese, but all of those microflora and fauna, etc., that are aged on the boards go into here. It's also worth saying that they update those slats. They update their spruce slats. They're not reusing the old ones. They put new wood in every now and again in order to regenerate those flora and fauna. So yes, a real labour of love.
Absolutely.
Now I'm going on to the next wine. I am excited about, or three wines. Good reminder. Thank you, Catherine. We have got 3 Chardonnays this evening. And before I whiz through all 3, I would like to explain why I wanted to choose the Chardonnay with my Comte, which I actually, before my sins, haven't opened yet. So I'll do that in a moment when Catherine starts talking about it. But I wanted a Chardonnay because I think personally, we eat a huge amount of Comte in our house. This is a particularly young end of the Comte spectrum. I think it's a 12-monther. And I find that with Comte, you have this incredible texture. It can be creamy, but it's also quite tart. And I often find when I pair red wines with it, something doesn't quite work. And Chardonnay, even though all of the wines I recommended are unoaked, I think Chardonnay, the grape variety itself, has this incredible texture in the mouth that it can marry that creaminess, but it can still retain a sort of tart freshness as well. So I'll tell you a bit about, apparently I'm struggling to be understood still. Is that the case for everyone? I will turn my microphone up. So apologies, members, if this is then loud, but I'm just going to manually turn my microphone up and we'll see what happens. Is that better? I think it's George saying that he can't hear. George, is that better? Okay. Oh, interesting, George. I apologize. I would speak more slowly and more clearly, but that's my microphone up at quite a high volume. So it looks like everyone else can hear, so I apologize. I'll stop turning away from the microphone as well, because that doesn't help. So, I forgot to show you the final 2 pictures. Of my sincerest apologies, because we didn't show you the cows in the valley. So there we are. We've got the cows, And you can really see the landscape here. It is rugged. It is definitely mountainous. So these were the cows that went into the last wine. Now I'm going to talk about the 3 wines. Obviously, you won't be expected to have all 3. I've got one, Catherine's got one, and unfortunately the Les Gravettes, which was the original choice, sold out before either of us could get it. So I'm tasting the Pesquié this evening. It is a Chardonnay, but it's a Vin de France. And the reason it's a Vin de France is it's actually from the Ventoux, which is in the Rhône. And Pesquié is a beautiful producer in the Rhône, started in the early 90s by a gentleman called Paul Chardonnay. And he wanted to plant Chardonnay because Ventoux has this amazing, not microclimate, I wouldn't say, but the elevation of Mont Ventoux allows for very different grapes to be grown compared to lots of other parts of the Rhône. It's got different soils all around it. So I would say there's no universal soil for Ventoux, but what you are looking at is that elevation, that cooler climate, and then it can retain acidity. So you'll find grapes that in the Southern Rhône would normally fall flat, like Merlot, grows beautifully on Ventoux. And Chardonnay is another, I was about to say victim, quite the opposite. Chardonnay can be another success story from the Ventoux. This particular Chardonnay comes from a clay and limestone parcel on the hillside, and it's about 200 to 300 meters of altitude. So you've got enough altitude to start giving you freshness here. In terms of what I look for when I'm trying to find a Chardonnay, and we're all unfortunately victims at the moment of the very, very sad and challenged vintage that Burgundy had last year. So it's really good to branch out to other French Chardonnays. So I was conscious I really, really didn't want to use a Burgundy. And that's why you'll see in a moment, none of the wines I chose were from Burgundy. But I think what this wine particularly does is this has really amazing freshness. And it does take a while to open in the glass. So give it a good swirl. But really it does what Chardonnay does best when it's on the lightest end of the spectrum. So hopefully you're going to get minerality. You should get some citrus fruits, maybe some more preserved lemon or cooked lemon rather than your Chablis-esque lemons. Some white flowers as well. When Chardonnay's at those cooler climates, it gives this beautiful blossom. But for me, the texture really works for this wine. So I'm going to taste this one and then I'll quickly talk about the other 2. Well, Catherine's going to have to help me on wine number 3 because I don't have any. It does what I think Chardonnay does best. It's chunky, it's juicy, it's meaty, it's fatty without being flabby. So for me, that's why it's always a Comte winner for me. Obviously, if you can drink a Grand Cru Burgundy with your Comte, then please do. The nuttier the Comte for me, the more age you should have on your Chardonnay. Whereas this being a relatively youthful Comte, I didn't think we needed to do that. So this was a 2020 vintage. I'll just talk quickly about the next wine. So we've had one from the Ventoux, which is southeast of the Rhône area. This is from the northern part of the Rhône, northern part of the southern Rhône. So that didn't explain that very well. The Ardeche area is basically between the north and the south. It actually hugs the top of the southern Rhône. And here we don't have quite the same level of cooling influence, but we do have very, very rigorously controlled grapes. They're also pressed very gently, and then when they're fermented, they are done so in a thermo stainless steel regulator. So they don't let the temperatures go too high. So what that does is it sort of slowly extracts lighter fruit flavors. The higher you put the temperature on your fermentation, you start to extract different things. And that's really not what they're trying to do here. It's seen no aging in oak, but it does have a kind of richness and texture. I have to say I'm gutted this wine had sold out and now annoyingly is back today or yesterday. I will be grabbing some more bottles of this. I think it's fantastic. It's produced by a cooperative. It's been around since the 60s. And 7 major carb cooperatives basically got together and agreed to modernize, to replant, and then to look after all of the marketing, etc. So yes, it's from sort of humble beginnings of the local cooperative, but actually it's really elevated in quality. And I think for £8.95, there's not many Chardonnays on the market for me from France that do the job that this one does. So if you haven't tried it before, please do give it a go. And then last but not least, the Stopgap Chardonnay. You'll notice that none of the wines were an appellation wine here, and that's because all of the wines that I chose are not, they're all from Chardonnay, but not from regions that allow or permit Chardonnay in their rules and regs. So I've got 3 little rule breakers for you. The last one could be an IGP because it was from a region from one area. This is a Vin de France, and that is because it's a blend. It's a multi-regional blend that Marcel Alford-Williams, our buyer for the Rhone, makes. He also buys from the southwest of France and the south. And this particular wine comes from Limoux, and I have to say Limoux Chardonnays right down on the south, but at elevation in the mountains. Unbelievably good Chardonnay quality coming from Limoux. You got a lot of good sparkling wines there if you want to tip members as well. Then also from the central Languedoc. Now that will add a bit more fleshiness to it. It will be a bit warmer in the Languedoc. And then there is a dash coming from the Mâconnais. But the nice thing about this wine is Marcel describes it as a good alternative to a sort of entry-level Burgundy because you do get complexity through blending. So it's unoaked, it's ripe citrus, it's peachy. There is a bit of buttery roundness, as we said, but it's still acidic in a good way. It's got that lovely, nice acidity that will cut through the Comte, but it's got the mouthfeel to manage the richness of the cheese as well. So Catherine, you've got that one, don't you?
It is very drinkable. That's what I would say about this Chardonnay. It is really, really delicious. And I think you got it spot on. And Marcel and Jacques Depagneux got it spot on as well with the blend, because it really does have all those qualities. That lovely fleshy fruit from the Languedoc, you know, the ripeness from Limoux, and then that little bit from the Mâconnais, that real typical sort of white Burgundy flavour that you would expect. And I mean, it's really quite inspired as a Chardonnay wine. And for it to be the Stopgap, I mean, I would almost hazard a guess that they might need to rename it in a couple of years, and it might be like a shelf staple, not necessarily just a Stopgap. I would maybe buy this over other Burgundy, you know, like, you know, it's maybe bold to say, but I think I really would. It's really delicious.
It's a really clever wine, isn't it?
It really is.
Such a good job.
Yeah, and with the cheese as well, it's excellent. I mean, I'm so pleased to see a Comte in the lineup because it is one of my favorite cheeses. It's got that really, really lovely nutty, sort of savory, fruity quality, and then when you get the nice little crunchy bits and that extra texture coming through, it really, really is delicious. Before we go on to talking about the cheese, we've had a question from Tim saying, I drink a lot of white Burgundy. Lucky Tim. What English cheese would you recommend? Now, Anna, I would start off, I would say a cheddar. I would go great, a cheddar. Dependent on obviously the style of cheddar does depend on the style of white Burgundy you've got. But I would say a medium to strong, nice farmhouse cheddar would be a really great pairing.
Yeah, I've spotted somebody say they get a bit nervous about pairing Chardonnay with cheese, and actually the irony is it's a pretty good all-rounder Chardonnay with lots of cheeses. Yeah. I wouldn't try it with the Bleu, and I wouldn't try it with a goat, but I would try it with your Reblochon. Yeah. Particularly those of you who have the Ardeche, which is a little bit richer, I would say, than the other two. The other two are a bit more fruit forward. If you have got it, try it with the Reblochon. I would say a Baron Bigod as well. We mentioned it earlier. Baron Bigod, anything for me with a slight hint of nut, some creamy texture. You want to avoid, Julia said Lincolnshire Poacher and Chardonnay. Yes, Julia.
Absolutely.
Nuts, those sort of more savoury notes, but with that hint of sweetness. That's what Chardonnay does well. That's what Chardonnay's all about. It's about sweetness, nuts. And again, like Catherine said, if you're drinking Premier Cru Chardonnay that's been barrel fermented and barrel aged and lees stirred and is very, very complex, then you need to pair it with a more complex cheese. And if you are going with, you know, your Cathedral City or other brands are available, then you go simple Chardonnay. But Chardonnay does cope really, really well with cheese. So don't be afraid to pair Chardonnay with cheese. It can be absolutely delightful.
Absolutely. So
I'll hand over to you to talk about the French cheese then, Catherine.
Yes, let's have a little bit of a chat about the Comte. So this is the Comte Saint-Antoine, and it is a raw milk cow's cheese. So yeah, cow's milk, raw milk to make it. And in terms of Comte, it's like its history as a cheese. It's been being made in the Massif de Jura for over 8 centuries in small village-based cooperatives called fruitières. And the milk is delivered daily so the Saint-Antoine, it's delivered daily from their surrounding dairies within no more of an 8-mile radius of the cooperative. So they're all about the freshness and retaining the characteristic profile of the milk, which will reflect the soil and the climate and the pasture of the region. And then once it's at a few weeks old, they then move them to the cellars of the Affinage. So you can see here, they're into the cellars. And they're graded at 4 months, they're graded to determine whether they're good enough to be awarded the green band, which denotes the highest quality of Comte. So you can see him here with his little, I'm going to call it a hammer because I don't know the real specific French or cheese term for it, but giving a little bit of a tap. And I think from previous sessions that we've had with Ben in terms of the sort of the way that they here for the grading is almost a little bit like with bread. You're kind of listening for sort of the density and the hollow kind of sound of the cheese. So they grade the cheese, and then if it is at the top level, it is awarded the green band, and that identifies it clearly. So I think perhaps on the slide that we had, Anna, that showed the wedge of cheese, that may have shown the band on there. You can see sort of around the top, and the Marcel Petit, so this is the cheese that we have this evening, is they only select a Comte matured by Marcel Petit at his maturing rooms, and his maturing rooms are in an old fort of Saint-Antoine. It's a defunct military fort, and he identified it in 1966 as the perfect location for his most precious cheeses. I would imagine that is in part due to the probably some quite secure doors and gating going on, but also when you look at these sort of forts and sort of the cellars and things that are into hillsides, they really do help in keeping the coolness and the sort of freshness of the air that's needed to help these cheeses mature in the perfect environment. Because it is located close to the dairies, it's at an altitude of 36,000 feet. It's constructed of cut and vaulted stone into the mountainside, so it does give them the perfect environment for maturing their wheels of Comte. And you'll notice as well that how big those wheels are, and then how much is then portioned out, which sometimes when you think about whether size matters, for want of a better word. If you think of perhaps a magnum in comparison to a standard bottle of wine and the sort of way that a wine will mature dependent on the size, the cheese as well, with that larger size, it does mean that it is a more uniform maturation, and it does help to have a bit more of a the complexity is spread throughout the cheese rather than just being having to really sort of focus on a smaller sort of portion of the cheese. Again, this is a real labor of love. It's regularly turned, brushed, it's rubbed with brine to create the perfect balance of richness and sweetness that is really characteristic of the cheese. And with this rind as well, it's one that, I mean, Ben always says you can eat any rind, you can try them, it's not going to damage you. It's a little bit firmer, but if you do eat a little bit of the rind, it does adds that little bit more of a savory complexity, I find, or at least if you're getting quite close to the rind where you get the change in color from the paste. But what I love to do, and I don't know about you, Anna, is I tend to keep my rinds, pop them in the freezer, and then just add them to food, so add them into a ragu if I'm doing something, and let it sort of melt through.
I've never heard of that, Catherine.
Oh, well, that's something to do with your rinds if you don't want to just throw them away if they're a firm rind. And it's particularly, this cheese then ends up being particularly fruity and smooth, and it's mellow, it's nutty, it's got a long finish, everything we've spoken about. And John, actually, yeah, that's a good point that you've sort of raised there about the more variation from the outer to the center in a large round to a smaller one. And yes, there is, because just on the basis of the size of the cheese, but I think that's something that is quite nice to have, that variation within a wedge. Ideally, the way I would like to enjoy a round of cheese is always to have a wedge, so you've got a bit of everything throughout. So the more to the center, you've got the sweeter, fruitier, perhaps slightly milder flavor from the cheese, and then as you get out towards the rind, it is getting a slight richer quality. It's where it's been rubbed with that brine, it's more savory, a little bit denser as well, and it adds the complexity of it. It's a nice way to enjoy the cheese, where you are going from sort of the nose to the end. So if you have it all the way through,
never cut the nose off the cheese.
Never cut the nose. It's it's apparently very bad manners in the cheese world. I don't know about you, I kind of just snaffle it down, but
oh no, my dad's a big cheese man, and we were told do not, because you get a different taste, so everyone needs to get the same taste, from sweet to salty. Everyone needs to get an even portion of the pie.
But it's really, really delicious, and I think it was a really great pairing, a really great choice.
Thank you. I think yes, so sorry, somebody said what's the cheese that we were talking about that went with Chardonnay? That was Baron Bigod. And I think Peter's kindly written it in the chat, and I've written it into the Q&A to your reply, Tim, as well. And I've also seen, Catherine, that lots of people add their Parmesan rinds to their sauces. So
yes,
I'm in minority.
Save your rinds. They had a really lovely umami hit.
Oh, fabulous. I have to say, Comte is just such a wonderful, easy cheese to love, isn't it? It's a cheese board staple for me, and it's very hard to find an enemy of a good quality Comte. There's a lot of rubbish out there, but a good quality one is fantastic. Now, members, I'm going to have to be really honest with you. I can't tell you much about this wine, but it's within good reason. I can tell you what you can see, so if you can't read that, then don't worry. I'll tell you a little bit about it, because I will say that Tim Sykes, who buys this wine, has bought it from a very esteemed producer, and it is their the wines that didn't go into the final blend. That's not to say that they weren't necessarily good enough, but for that year, what they wanted to achieve, the way that lots of wines, particularly Sauternes, but many, many other wines, particularly from big producers around the world or high quality producers, they act a bit like, I don't know, chefs, you could almost say, and that's why chef de cave, I'm sure, I know it means boss, but I'm sure there's some assimilation with the language. They choose the ingredients they want that year, but they will have still had to grow the grapes from lots of different places. And so you often get asked the question, well, what happens with the grapes that don't make it? And the answer is the world's best value Sauternes, Wine Society exclusive. So Ulysse Cazabonne is actually a blend of 3 vintages, which is quite unusual. This one's 2014, 15, 16. Doesn't always have to be. We haven't got a recipe for it. We're just very gladly taking some excellent quality wines and taking a blend of the different vintages. Tim Sykes, bearing in mind he is our buyer for Bordeaux and has worked at the Wine Society for 10 years, he described it as the best value wine that he has ever come across in his time. So we can't reveal who it is. I will instead tell you a little bit about how it's made, because I think that will do a job of explaining why it's so beautiful with blue cheese. a lot of our pairings, or I would say all of our pairings tonight, Catherine, I think you'd agree, have matched. We've intentionally gone for things that we think are good marriages. Sometimes, though, some of the best pairings are polar opposites. And there are some beautiful things about Sauternes and blue cheese that are similar, but the real one is that they're both made with mold. And quite frankly, I don't think anyone is saying, let's have a pairing based on mold. But it's true. The blue cheese is obviously, Catherine will talk about how the mold gets onto that one. But Sauternes is produced, and Barsac, Montbazillac sometimes to an extent, and other fine wines in the world, Tokai, they're produced by a situation whereby the grapes are infected, this doesn't sound very nice, covered beautifully by a rot called Botrytis cinerea. And that rot punctures the skin of the grapes. And not only does it dehydrate them and turn them into these gorgeous golden raisins that we press and make juice, but it imparts some flavor too. So we often find wines that have undergone a botrytized situation in the vineyard have certain characteristics to them. Different people pick out different things. So some people pick out candied ginger. I tend not to get that one so much. That's not to say it's not true. It's just not what my receptor gets. I often get things like marmalade and dried fruits. So I get particularly dried pineapple, dried mango. As soon as I'm in a blind tasting, if I smell dried mango, my head immediately thinks, is there botrytis in this wine? Not always, but it's where my brain goes to. Now, the reason I think this pairing goes so well together, before I steal Catherine's thunder on the cheese, is because the French in particular would drink something like Sauternes with all this sweetness with something exceptionally salty. We've inherited a bit of a tradition of having Sauternes at the end of a meal with sweet foods. And whilst that is absolutely delicious, the alternative is to pair it with salty foods. So many of you, I'm sure, will already know that you can easily pair Sauternes with things like pâtés, with very salty. We did a tasting with a Sauternes expert, didn't we, Catherine? Salt and vinegar crisps. That was the go-to.
Yeah,
so,
and sausages.
And sausages, exactly.
Little chipolatas and some Sauternes.
So there is a much more French tradition to pair Sauternes with salty things. So it made absolute sense for us to have Sauternes and a very, very salty blue cheese. I appreciate it's not the blue cheese we had ordered for you all members, but unfortunately we had a logistics problem getting them over from France. But Catherine is very kindly going to tell you a little bit more about the cheese, and then I hope you just enjoy the pairing and you're happy to know, or not know, I should say. We don't know who made it. We can assume they're rather darn good. But the quality of this wine, I have to say, I have purchased a few cases myself to keep hold of. I think it will age well. It's really top notch, and I hope that you enjoy the cheese and the pairing.
Wonderful. So, I mean, it really is a delicious wine, isn't it? And now I'm actually having it with the cheese, Anna. So I said to Anna just before we started, and I was getting my cheeses out, opening up the Roquefort was quite an assault to the senses, where it had been nice and cold in the fridge and really unassuming. But once it was opened and warmed up a little bit, it really is it's quite potent of a cheese. But let's talk about it. So this is the Roquefort Le Arbus, and it is again a raw milk cheese, and this is made from sheep's milk, considered one of the greatest blue cheeses in the world. It was mentioned by Pliny in AD 79 and has been protected since 1411. And the cheese can only be made with the milk of the local Lacorne brand or breed of sheep, which you can see on your screens here. There are some really strict rules governing the making of Roquefort, which are set out in the AOC. So the very first bestowed on a cheese in 1925. The protection of Roquefort was further refined in 1961, when it was decided that while Roquefort could be made across several regions of the south of France, it could only be classed as Roquefort if it were matured in the natural caves of Mont-Combalot in the commune of Roquefort-sur-Salzoun. And the caves are situated around Roquefort, which provide the ideal conditions for maturing blue cheese. So they're moist, they're cool, and they're breezy. The Roquefort will be aged here for around 3 months as its blue veining develops. Now that blue veining is something that does develop through the cheese the curds being inoculated with Penicillium roqueforti. That is the bacteria that is sort of not infected, but imparted into the unpasteurized sheep's milk, into the curds, to get that lovely blue veining through the cheese. And it's then pressed into a mold. And they have some sort of air channels pierced into the cheese with skewers to open up a bit of space to let the mold grow in and sort of grow throughout the cheeses. This one is made by the Roquefort Arbus is made by La Fromagerie Occitan, which specializes in making traditional cheeses from the Auvergne-Pyrenees and Roquefort regions. And this cheese itself is in a class of its own. I can see that a few people are already saying how it's sublime, it's the perfect pairing. And, you know, Anna, it may well be the perfect pairing of the evening. It's ripened without a rind, which is quite unlike sort of blue cheeses we may be more familiar with in the UK, like Stilton. And it's got a lovely sort of damp and crumbly paste. So it's really spreadable, which I love about Roquefort, that you can, you know, really get a really good coating on a cracker. And it's a really lovely harmonious balance between that sweet and salty. And again, which is something that goes really nicely with the Sauternes, and that sweet and salty sort of opposites attract that Anna was talking about earlier. You've also got a little bit of that slight crunchy mold texture as well, which also gives a nice bit of complexity to the cheese and adds that bit of difference against the really sort of creamy paste and the white part of the cheese. Now, before we kind of finish up and go on, I would just like to share a little bit of the legend that you may be aware of. You may not be, but this is the legend of the first creator of Roquefort. So where we spoke about, you know, we referred to Limoux earlier on this evening and how they make some lovely sparkling wines, and you may be aware that Limoux has a nice sort of story of the origin of sparkling wines by a happy accident. The legend is that Roquefort sort of came about in the same way. So it was thought that the first creator was a young shepherd, and he was sitting in the mouth of a cave just to have a little rest while his sheep were grazing on the mountain pastures. And he spied his lady love in the distance and decided to leave his little bundle of lunch, which was cheese and rye bread, in the cave, so it was protected, and he'd go and visit her. And then sometime later, he returned and he found that his cheese was now speckled with blue molds from the rye bread, rye being a grain that is particularly susceptible to ergot, and that sort of mold coming through and that fungal infection. So it kind of spread into the cheese. He was poor and hungry, so he decided to eat it anyway and found it was a delicious pairing, a delicious addition to the cheese. And then it became a practice to actually leave the cheese in the cave with some rye bread and let it become Roquefort. Now, obviously, over years, that has refined in terms of the production methods, and whether that is a true story or not, it's a very nice one to end on. I think, Anna, it's, you know, adds that romance and storytelling to our cheese and wine pairing again.
I love that story, Catherine. I can't believe I've never heard it. Oh, I absolutely love it. I don't know if I don't know if it's the sort of experiment I want, but much like the first person who ever decided to press moldy grapes from the valley of Sauternes or Barsac, who said, that looks delicious, let's press the blue fuzzy grapes and see what happens. Yes, happy accidents with mold, I think, or bacteria, is the key to this pairing. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Catherine. We've had a couple of questions, so we'll hang about to answer a couple of those. The first one is from Colin Harvey, who's asked a very good question, which is, are there any drier styles of wine that go with Roquefort? Catherine, do you want to take it first, and then I'll...
I would Yeah.
I can give my thoughts. Yeah.
If you get a dry style of wine that is very fruit forward, that has a real ripeness to the fruit. I mean, and I think for me, it would be something that is quite a fleshy yellow fruit flavor to it. So you might think, oh, a dry fruity wine, perhaps a Gewürztraminer or something. But for me, that would be the wrong style of fruit. You want something that's quite ripe and fleshy and apricotty, all those sort of flavors you're getting in a Sauterne in a dry style. I personally wouldn't choose a dry wine, but Anna, I don't know if you've got a specific example in mind.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I don't know if there's many dry white wines out there that have enough oomph to go with Roquefort. I think if I was going to pick a dry wine, I would pick a dry red, but I would make sure that it was a red, exactly as Catherine said. The fruit has to be dominant for me, because I know Roquefort and red Bordeaux is a very popular pairing. I think there's better things to pair your red Bordeaux with personally. I actually find the funnest red wines to pair with Roquefort are your kind of new world, not jammy blockbusters, but those really like fruity, not oak necessarily. I don't think the vanilla goes great, or those more heavily oak flavors, but your really ripe Cabernets, your really ripe Syrahs from Australia that are more blue and black fruits. And I think that for me is where I would go from a dry wine style. But I'm a bit like Catherine. I think the pleasure of a Roquefort with a sweet wine, be it port. I know somebody mentioned that they would normally have had a port and that actually the Sauterne won. I do think it's a wine that needs, I do think it's a cheese that actually lends itself to a bit of sugar. It makes an explosion in your mouth. It makes the cheese saltier. It makes the wine sweeter. And I suppose that's one thing to say. When you're pairing food and wine, saltiness is always going to bring up the fruit. So whatever you do, you're going to increase your perception of fruit flavors. So if you're kind of honest and open at the beginning and you pair a really fruity wine, for me, you're hitting the brief. So fruity reds would be my preference, but it has to be fruity, exactly like Catherine said.
Yeah.
Don't think musty wines and musty cheeses is a brilliant combination. Too much must.
I like to think almost that your wine, not necessarily taking the place, but acts in the same way as a fruit accompaniment would to the cheese. So your fruit sort of compotes and chutneys that you are pairing with your cheese, putting on your cheese board, the fruit you're having, so figs and things like that. So if you think about the fruits that you would perhaps eat with the cheese, look for those fruits in the wines, in the sort of the flavor profile, but absolutely one that doesn't have too much going on in terms of any sort of oak aging. I think tannin as well, look for one that's either very sort of integrated and plush and soft, or low in tannin from grapes that naturally have a low tannic structure.
And Adrian's just mentioned Malbec, and actually Malbec surprisingly doesn't always need to be tannic. Some of the juicier, more affordable Malbecs that aren't very extracted would be a great choice, Adrian. Those really sort of young, ripe, plush, plummy, very fruit forward, try and avoid the oak. All of those sorts of things are really good, but you need to match power with power. Whatever you do, wimpy wines, not going to work. We've had another question from a member who asks, what makes a dessert wine different in terms of sweetness? So Andrew, I might quickly answer that two-partedly. Well, first of all, I'll say we've just proved that you don't need to have Sauterne with dessert. You can have it with cheese and sausages. But in terms of what makes a sweet wine sweet, lots of different methods can be used. But the method here that I've been describing effectively dehydrates the grape to the point that they're raisins. So when you press those grapes, there's very little water. So it's just the same as adding your Ribena concentrate. You basically imagine you've got your glass of Ribena concentrate, how sweet that is, or your orange squash. In a normal grape, that's topped up with loads of water and that sweetness is dissipated. But the intensity of it takes flavor, acidity, and sugar, which then effectively becomes alcohol and leftover sugar in the wine. And so it's like drinking the equivalent of your squash without adding the water in. Wines, they've added the water, and then what happens is the yeast can digest that pre-mixed squash more easily, convert all of that sugar into alcohol, and that's fine. When they're trying to, sorry, I turned away again. When they're trying to do it with a sauterne, when the yeast are fermenting to create an alcohol, they actually end up dying because the sugar is so high and the alcohol is at the level where those yeasts just stop basically producing alcohol. So instead of getting this ridiculously strong 20-30% alcohol wine, that can't happen. The yeast can't do that. So they basically leave some of that sugar left over. So it's a bit like, it's a two-part process, but effectively having those grapes raisined is the important bit about this particular wine. But effectively most sweet wines, unless you're stopping the yeast converting the sugar to alcohol, which some do, most of the time it basically reaches its maximum limit. No more alcohol can be produced. Whatever's left over is the sugar. And then the second part to that is, if you want a comparison, the wines that we tasted 1, 2, and 3 were probably under 5 grams per litre of sugar, because there might be a little bit left. And I don't know technically exactly what they were, but let's say they're probably under 5. Can't taste, you can sort of start to taste it at 6, and I can't taste any at all in any of those wines. Sauterne, and correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, is it 130 grams per litre?
So, yeah.
I should know that. But I think it's around 115 to 140. So I think in a wine like that, you're looking at like 125 grams per litre. So that just gives you a bit of context to understand how much sugar is left in these wines.
I think the only thing that I would slightly add as well, Anna, is that it also depends on your dessert. So you're looking, in terms of the sweetness of the wine, as long as it's sweeter than your dessert, you're not going to lose anything. So you can have a wine that you might have a dessert wine that goes really nicely with a light sort of fruit tart, but it wouldn't hold its own against something really dense and chocolatey. So that as well is something just to kind of consider in terms of your balance. And in that is more of a partnership of the balance between flavor and intensity and sweetness. As long as it's that bit sweeter than your yeah, Roger and Jean, yeah, I am a real foodie, yes. But as long as it's sweeter than your dessert, you're good to go, really.
Exactly. Dessert wine, one person's dessert wine could be another person's aperitif, and one chocolate tart dessert wine is not necessarily the same as like you say, a light lemon mousse.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much, members. Oh, I had so much fun tonight, Catherine. I loved these cheeses, I have to say. I've really enjoyed doing our British cheeses. It's been fantastic, and I've loved the last few sessions. But there's something about tasting France. I think I genuinely you get transported when you taste a French cheese, which is really lovely. And I think the quality was top notch tonight. So hats off to the Fine Cheese Company for allowing Catherine and I free reign on their cheese. And thank you, Catherine. It's always a pleasure to do these with you. And I loved both your pairings tonight. I thought they were absolutely sensational.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you very much, members, for joining us. If you are interested in any more food and wine events, we have got a couple coming up. We've got in a couple of weeks, actually, we've got a Greek food and wine event. And we've also got myself and Anna back doing one of our Friday night takeaways, looking at some sushi pairings. So have a look at the website, see what's coming up, and join us again if you can. But it was lovely to have you this evening. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Catherine.
Cheers.
Bye.